You have to admit, Bobby, you went after G and Connor. Hoffa for the mob. Worst people in America. You didn't just have them arrested. You humiliated them. You called them little girls on the stand. Business with Castro. The exiles, assassination attempts. You didn't just do what you had to do. You went the extra mile. You made it about good and evil. Made it about me and them, good guys, the bad guys. Used my name, my position. You don't think that the Cubans and the mob, maybe the Russians, went after me because they knew that if they took me out, they'd chop you off at the knees?
Not how it was.
The only way to get little brother off their backs was to go for Jack. What if it all leads back to you? What if the thread that connects everything is my own brother? Was anyone else that close to me?
It's not how it is.
Did anyone use me the way you did?
Use you? I protected you. You used me.
Hoffa was right. You were just another lawyer without me in the Oval Office.
I didn't get you killed.
Put a prosecutor as good as you were on the case, he can get a conviction. Isn't it true that time after time, you made your enemies your brother's enemies?
I did what I had to do.
But the way you did it, Mr. Kennedy, the enjoyment you took in cutting those people down to size, you don't think that that made the world a more dangerous place for your brother?
When slavery ended in America, the ruling class didn't panic. They adjusted. They had no intention of giving up free labor. They never did. And here's the part people forget. Black people weren't the first slaves on this soil. The earliest were poor whites, Catholics, Irish, Poles, Russians, people driven out of Europe by famine, persecution, and war. They landed in America with nothing. They dug the ditches, worked the fields, put up the buildings. They laid the foundation for the empire that would become the United States. When the Civil War ended and the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the old machine had a problem. The labor pool disappeared overnight. So the system reinvented itself. They wrote new laws, designed not to punish crime, but to create criminals. Suddenly, the prisons filled up, overwhelmingly with black men. And those men were leased out, chain-ganged, worked to the bone on roads and fields. It was slavery with a new label, prison labor. Food, rags, a shower, that was the deal. Most never made it out. And while the country patted itself on the back for ending slavery, the truth was, it never did. The names changed. The methods changed. The principle stayed the same. America was addicted to cheap labor. First, the ex-slaves. Then, immigrants. Today, it's undocumented workers. Mexicans, Central Americans, men and women breaking their backs in the fields of California, sweating on construction sites, doing the jobs nobody else will do. No unions, no safety standards, no rights. Just another form of expendable labor. Politicians call it compassion. A better life for people crossing the border. But it's really business. Corporations want the bodies, not the responsibility. Tech companies siphon engineers from India. Growers use migrants to pick fruit. Contractors keep costs low with undocumented crews. And the government looks the other way because the elites never intended to give working Americans what they were promised. A fair wage, a decent living. Even the minimum wage, forced through by Franklin Roosevelt, is under siege. Billions are spent convincing the public that it's unnecessary. The protections fought by FDR, Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa are stripped away piece by piece. The ground shifts under workers' feet, and nobody in power cares. The mob understood this before anyone. They saw the rot up close because they were part of it. One mob boss, powerful, feared, once stopped his car near his property when he saw a chain gang breaking rocks on the side of the road. He pointed to the men in stripes and told his son, "Look, that's what they brought us here to do. When we came to this country, we were the slaves. But we didn't stay there. We organized. We built. We paid in blood. If we'd stayed idle, we'd be out there in chains with them. Don't ever forget it." The lesson wasn't lost. He reminded his son about the Sicilians in Louisiana, the 1891 lynchings, the way the elites despised working people. Italian, black, Irish. It didn't matter. Politicians were greedy, stupid, and corrupt. The game was simple: conquer or be conquered. The Matranga family, tied to Carlos Marcello, shook hands on this truth. The Sicilians learned fast, and by the time Luciano rose, they weren't the new slaves anymore. They were on their way to running America. There were always two sides to the organized crime coin. On one side, the surface looked shiny. Illegal, yes, but often tolerated, sometimes even morally excused. Gambling was the perfect example. For decades, it was outlawed across America. Then cities and states realized it was a goldmine. Legalize it, tax it, invite the lobbyists in, and suddenly gambling wasn't a crime. It was an industry. Politicians who once called it a scourge were now counting their cut in campaign donations and real estate deals. Senator Estes Kefauver made his name blasting the mob over gambling. But when Meyer Lansky confronted him, when he asked what the real issue was, Kefauver dropped the mask. "I don't want people like you involved." Kefauver was a Protestant. Lansky was a Jew. Luciano was a Catholic immigrant. To men like Kefauver, it wasn't the gambling that was the problem. It was who controlled it. Lansky, Luciano, Costello, they read it as racism. The establishment had no issue with gambling itself. They just didn't want the working-class outsiders, Sicilians, Jews, Catholics, holding the reins of an industry that could rival the bankers, the industrialists, the respectable American elite. That was the clean side of the coin. Over time, the very rackets the mob built, gambling, lotteries, even cannabis, would all go legitimate. But the other side was darker. Luciano himself warned his men to stay clear. He drew the line at what he called the dirty rackets. Underage prostitution, what we call child trafficking today, and human smuggling. That was the poison no one could ever clean. The end of World War II turned Europe into fertile ground for predators. Cities in France and Italy lay in rubble. Women were so desperate they'd trade themselves for a packet of cigarettes, then resell each cigarette on the street just to survive. The Corsican Mafia turned this misery into an industry. They trafficked young girls and boys across Europe, funneling them into America. Once inside, most vanished, some overdosed, some were killed. The rest were broken beyond repair. This wasn't business. This was leverage. Politicians compromised in hotel rooms, judges caught in photographs, blackmail that bought protection and power. And when the mob loosened its grip, intelligence agencies picked it up. The same networks that trafficked bodies now served governments. It wasn't just organized crime anymore, it was organized power. Washington had its own mafia, and it wore suits. By 1958, Robert Kennedy walked straight into that world. His war on organized crime began with a meeting with Aaron Cohen, a private investigator out of Louisiana. Cohen had gone after Carlos Marcello so hard in the 50s that he himself got locked up, punished by the very politicians who protected the boss. When Cohen sat down with Kennedy, he laid it all out: the rackets, the politicians on the take, the power Marcello held across Louisiana. Kennedy listened. What Cohen didn't realize was that he'd just lit the fuse on Kennedy's war. And Robert Kennedy never walked away from a fight. But fights like this don't end clean. You could criticize the Kennedys for plenty: their use of power, their mistakes in Vietnam, the shadow operations they signed off on overseas. But Robert Kennedy was right about one thing: corruption had America in a chokehold, and wresting it back would take sacrifices. The price was written in blood. First his brother John, then Robert himself. Robert Kennedy declared war on organized crime. What he never understood was that his own family's fortune was tied to it. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy, made his first millions in the 1920s, running with the same men Robert swore to bring down. Bootlegging, market manipulation, it didn't matter. Joe Kennedy laundered that money through Wall Street, turned it into another fortune before and during the Depression, and saw the crash coming because he was one of the men who helped create it. When Franklin D. Roosevelt rose, Joe Kennedy moved fast. He backed him early. Roosevelt repaid the loyalty with power. Kennedy's first big job was cleaning up Wall Street. The joke in Washington was the old line, "It takes a thief to catch a thief." But the Roosevelt machine was more calculating than that. FDR understood the new game. Luciano and his people had backed Al Smith in 28. Roosevelt studied the loss and saw an opening. Smith's Catholic faith had sunk him, but his ties to Tammany Hall and Costello's crew were even more dangerous. Roosevelt made his move through Judge Samuel Seabury, who launched investigations into Luciano's empire in the early 1930s. Then, Roosevelt sat down with Tammany. He offered them a deal, support him, and Seabury would back off. Half promise, half threat. It was genius, political blackmail wrapped in reform. Luciano thought he had the fix. Roosevelt pulled Seabury back. But then he sent Thomas Dewey after him. Dewey's prosecutions ripped Luciano's empire to shreds. What Roosevelt never touched was Louisiana. Not because he didn't know, because he was afraid. Huey Long ruled the state like a king. Even after his assassination in 1935, the Long family held power. Behind them, the Louisiana Mafia grew rich, expanding its reach into oil, gambling, shipping. By the 40s, their empire stretched across borders like the United Fruit Company, pulling in money from the Caribbean to Central America. The truth was buried under politics and business deals. The Mafia in Louisiana was no street gang. It was a corporation, a syndicate with global reach. And if you pulled too hard on that thread, you unraveled one of America's oldest secrets. Blackmail, money, intelligence operations, things that would later carry names like Operation Gladio, Operation X. The CIA's first crude jobs weren't cloak and dagger spy games. They were corporate hits. United Fruit was the prime example. Sam Zemere, the company's owner, had been tied to the Matranga family in New Orleans since the early 1900s. Together they built networks of labor, shipping, and influence. The Matranga clan had no ordinary crew. They were among the first organized crime syndicates in American history. They weren't imports. They were founders. In Louisiana, the Mafia wasn't a transplant from Sicily. It was born here. So when Robert Kennedy came storming in during the late 50s, armed with prosecutors and headlines, he thought he was going after gangsters. He didn't realize he was declaring war on a machine his father once bankrolled, and a government that quietly partnered with it. He wasn't fighting a crime family. He was stepping into a war with America itself. Washington, 1962. Jimmy Hoffa was sitting in Robert Kennedy's waiting room, seething. The Attorney General had promised him case files, phony charges, Hoffa believed, part of Kennedy's personal crusade to drag a working-class hero through the mud. Hoffa came in to collect them himself, face to face. But Kennedy kept him waiting. 5 minutes, 10, 20. For most men, an inconvenience. For Hoffa, it was torture. He was punctual to the second. Every minute past the hour felt like a personal insult. Frank Ragano, his lawyer, was with him that day. Ragano later wrote that Hoffa's anger boiled over the longer the clock ticked. Hoffa wasn't just irritated, he was ready to explode. When Kennedy finally walked in, calm, detached, dog in hand, Hoffa went off. He jumped to his feet, grabbed Kennedy by the neck, and slammed him against the wall. "I'll kill you," Hoffa snarled. "I'll kill your family. I'll kill your brother." The words poured out like fire. Hoffa's eyes were wild. Ragano tried to pull him back but couldn't budge him. Another Teamster official from Delaware jumped in too, but it took both men to get Hoffa off the Attorney General. Robert Kennedy stood there, pinned, speechless. His secretary watched, frozen. When Hoffa finally released him, the room was silent. Kennedy straightened himself, walked into his office, and wordlessly handed Hoffa the papers. Not a word. Just ice. The Delaware official later told his own story. His name was Frank Sheeran, the same Sheeran who, decades later, would confess to killing Hoffa. Ragano, bound by attorney-client privilege, never confirmed Sheeran's name while he was alive. But insiders knew. When people tried to reach Sheeran about Hoffa, he always redirected them to Ragano or William Bufalino. Kennedy didn't keep the incident quiet. The next day, he went public. He said Hoffa had threatened his life, his family's lives, and his brother's. He had reason to take it seriously. Informants like Ed Partin warned Kennedy of the danger. Even J. Edgar Hoover admitted hearing threats on FBI wiretaps. But Hoover dismissed it all as bluster. Just tough talk. That was Hoover's blind spot. He heard the same threats about himself on those tapes and wrote them off. He never understood. These men weren't bluffing. By then, Hoffa wasn't just a labor leader. He was a boss in his own right, controlling billions through the Teamsters Pension Fund. He could build or break empires with a loan, and if you threatened his empire, he would destroy you. Meanwhile, in the underworld, the talk grew darker. Santo Traficante told journalist Jose Aleman in 1962 that if Kennedy ever went to Dallas, he'd be hit. Carlos Marcello muttered the same thing to his inner circle. His own brother repeated it more than once. "We're going to kill that son of a bitch." John Martino, a mob-connected operator, confided to his son that Dallas would be the trap. "If Kennedy goes there," he said, "he won't come back." The war was on, and the warning signs were everywhere.
What are you looking at? You looking at my ears?
Sorry?
My ears. Are you looking at my ears?
Your ears? No.
I had an operation, so there's no need for anyone looking at my ears anymore?
Yeah, well, I ain't looking at your ears.
Right. Get out of here. Come on.
Frank Sheeran was no stranger to violence. He'd killed men in Europe during the war, and he'd killed men in America after it. But when Russell Bufalino called him in for a favor, it wasn't a hit. It was a delivery. A hauling truck, a racetrack in Florida. Sheeran did as he was told. At the end of the line, waiting for him, was a man he'd seen before. David Ferry. Ferry was a strange figure. Marcello's pilot, a closeted homosexual, and a pedophile. By the early 60s, he wasn't just working for Carlos Marcello. He was compromised by the CIA. That gave him protection, but it also made him dangerous. His name still hangs heavy in Louisiana law. Ferry's life connected him to two ghosts of the future. One was Lee Harvey Oswald. A photograph from the mid-1950s shows Oswald standing with Ferry at a Civil Air Patrol cookout long before Dallas. The other was Barry Seal, who would grow into one of the biggest cocaine traffickers in the Western Hemisphere, flying loads for the Colombian cartels with CIA protection. When Seal was finally marked for death, the contract passed through New York and down to Louisiana. Marcello's people refused to pull the trigger. They said he was too hot, too well guarded, but they opened the door. A Colombian hit team carried out the job. Seal's legend ended in a Baton Rouge parking lot. In The Irishman, there's a moment drawn from Frank's real life. He drops off a set of guns and later sees the man who took them on television, E. Howard Hunt, CIA operative, Bay of Pigs planner, future Watergate burglar. Hunt was already plugged into everything, the mob, the agency, Nixon's circle. When Sheeran met him, Hunt stared and said, "Are you looking at my ears?" Frank was baffled. Bufalino had warned him never to use names. Big ears was the mob's code for Hunt. He'd always been sensitive about them. The only way Hunt could have known was if he'd been listening in. Wiretaps. Not the FBI this time, but the CIA. Frank said no, he wasn't looking. Hunt cut him off. "There will be no more talk of my ears. They're not big anymore." He'd had surgery. And just like that, the conversation ended. When Sheeran got back to Bufalino, Russell was rattled. The CIA was listening in on mob conversations. That wasn't supposed to happen. But the truth was, by 62, everyone was spying on everyone. The Mafia had bugged FBI hangouts. The FBI had bugged mob joints. The CIA had bugged the mob, and sometimes the mob used the CIA for its own dirt. Sam Giancana was a prime example. In Chicago, he suspected one of his mistresses of cheating. Instead of hiring a private investigator, he called his CIA friends. They bugged the woman's room for him. The FBI traced the wire and followed the trail. It led not to private detectives, not to the outfit, but to CIA equipment placed at Giancana's request. Hoover brought it to Robert Kennedy. At first, Kennedy thought it was a win. Maybe Giancana could be nailed on the wiretap. But Hoover played his ace. The bugs weren't mob work. They were planted by the Central Intelligence Agency, for Giancana. Kennedy was stunned. He pressed Hoover to repeat it, and Hoover did. The CIA had wiretapped an American citizen's bedroom on behalf of a gangster. The Attorney General's stomach dropped. Kennedy already knew about the Bay of Pigs and the names attached to it. Men like Hunt, men like Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, Giancana, Roselli, Bufalino, Lansky, Ruby, the Cleveland Mafia, and Ferry. Now he had proof that the lines weren't blurred. They were gone. The mob, the CIA, big business, even foreign intelligence agencies were working as one. The CIA wasn't just running covert wars abroad. It was doing favors for gangsters at home. August 1962 was already a storm. Marilyn Monroe was dead. Joe Valachi was preparing to flip, ready to testify that the Mafia existed, with its rituals, its code, its reach back to Masonic lodges, and its presence in America since the turn of the century. He would confirm what Hoover had denied for decades, and what Kennedy now knew was worse than he'd ever imagined. Valachi's testimony would expose Hoover too. The director had been compromised in the 50s through his affairs with Roy Cohn and liquor baron Louis Rosenstiel. Organized crime had the FBI in its pocket. The CIA was running errands for mob bosses. Israel's Mossad, Italy's Gladio networks, foreign services everywhere. They were all tied into the same machine. Robert Kennedy believed he finally had enough to rip it out by the roots. He thought he could expose the rot and put the country back on track. What he didn't realize was that just weeks earlier, in July 1962, a man had stepped off a plane from Russia with a wife and a child. His name was Harvey Oswald. He would soon be seen in the company of men tied directly to Carlos Marcello, the head of the Matranga family, the boss of the Louisiana Mafia. The fuse was already lit. By the early 1960s, New Orleans was more than jazz clubs and Bourbon Street. It was a pressure cooker where organized crime, rogue intelligence, Cuban exile politics, and right-wing militancy all boiled together. At the center sat Carlos Marcello, boss of the oldest mafia family in America, whose reach ran from Louisiana oil leases to Las Vegas casinos to the Teamsters Pension Fund. Marcello's city was the crossroads, and everyone, CIA handlers, mobsters, Cuban soldiers of fortune, small-time hustlers, passed through it. One of those men was David Ferry. If New Orleans was a carnival, Ferry was one of its freak shows. A former Eastern Airlines pilot, he was famous for his painted-on eyebrows and bright red wigs, meant to cover alopecia that had left him completely bald. He kept cages of pigeons in his apartment, studied voodoo, and preyed on teenage boys. To outsiders, he looked like a crackpot. To insiders, he was indispensable. He flew missions for Marcello, helped run guns to Cuba, and, most damningly, turned up in the same Civil Air Patrol unit as a scrawny teenager named Lee Harvey Oswald. A photo survives, Ferry grinning in uniform, Oswald standing in the background. Years later, when investigators asked around, cadets remembered Ferry drilling Oswald, pulling him aside, even encouraging him toward the Marines. Ferry wasn't alone. Just blocks from Canal Street, in a dingy office at 544 Camp Street, worked another key figure, Guy Bannister. Once a high-ranking FBI agent in Chicago, Bannister had come south and set up as a private detective. His office doubled as a hub for Cuban exile groups and the radical right. It was here that leaflets supposedly promoting the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, Oswald's little movement, were printed. Some even carried Bannister's 544 Camp Street address by mistake, or by design. Witnesses swore they saw Oswald in and out of Bannister's office that summer of 1963. One remembered Oswald helping Ferry haul rifles from Bannister's closet into a car. This wasn't paranoia. In July 1963, the FBI got wind of a plan to bomb Cuba launched out of Louisiana. When agents raided a farm north of New Orleans, they found practice bombs, blasting caps, dynamite by the crate, even napalm ingredients. The men behind it were anti-Castro exiles, funded by wealthy Americans like Mike McClaney, a casino man from Batista's Havana days, whose investors included NFL owner Carol Rosenblum. These weren't fringe kooks. They were plugged into both big money and the mob. The FBI confiscated the weapons, but made no arrests. The camps kept training. Meanwhile, Oswald was playing his own part on the streets. He handed out pro-Castro leaflets on Canal Street, argued with Cuban exiles, staged a scuffle with Carlos Bringuier, the DRE's local leader. The papers called it chance. It wasn't. Bringuier had already met Oswald 3 times. Their fight drew cameras, and suddenly Oswald was in the news as a Castro sympathizer. Soon after, he was on local radio, then on television, humiliated when a journalist confronted him with his defection to Russia. In private, Oswald still praised Kennedy to his Russian wife, Marina. In public, he was being cast as the perfect traitor. Other shadows moved around him. Loran Hall, a Cuban adventurer and gun runner, bounced in and out of New Orleans. Hall had once fought beside Castro, then flipped and raided Cuba with anti-Castro groups. By 1967, he was in Jim Garrison's crosshairs, and by 1975 suing the National Tattler for calling him part of a sniper team in Dallas. In his suit, he insisted he was in California the day Kennedy died. But his life of raids, plots, and mob ties made him one more thread in the tangle of New Orleans. To Robert Kennedy, watching from Washington, these weren't random names. They were a map. Ferry, Bannister, Hall, Bringuier, Marcello. The Attorney General thought he was chasing mobsters and corrupt politicians. What he didn't realize was that he was staring straight at the center of the machine that would later swallow his brother in Dallas. Because when Kennedy was shot on November 22, 1963, the shooter's world didn't lead back to Moscow, or even Havana. It led down Highway 90, straight to New Orleans.
I'm curious to know just how you supported yourself during the 3 years that you lived in the Soviet Union. Did you have a government subsidy?
I worked in Russia. I was under the protection of that is to say, I was not under the protection of the American government, but that is, I was at all times considered an American citizen.
When Lee Harvey Oswald came back from Russia in 1962, he walked into a trap he didn't even see. On the streets of New Orleans, he was handing out leaflets for the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. He posed as a one-man movement, screaming about Cuba while drawing stairs on Canal Street. But behind the pose, he was tangled up with men who hated everything he supposedly stood for. David Ferry and Guy Bannister, both tied to Carlos Marcello, both open in their hatred of John and Robert Kennedy. Oswald's friends heard him praise Kennedy in private, especially around his Russian wife Marina. But in public, he was shoulder to shoulder with men who wanted the Kennedys dead. That contradiction alone tells you something deeper was happening. He had problems at home. His Russian wife and daughter had no citizenship. He needed papers, security. He turned to Dean Andrews, a lawyer, to help fix the immigration mess. Meanwhile, he played politics on the street. Oswald's movement was flimsy. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee in New York, legitimate, funded with international support, shut him out. But in New Orleans he kept pushing, passing out leaflets with unknown helpers. Then came the staged street fight with Carlos Branguier, the Cuban exile leader. The papers called it chance. In truth, Branguier and Oswald had met before, 3 times. Branguier even tried to recruit him. That summer Oswald became somebody. He debated on radio, appeared on local TV. But each time the walls closed in. On television, a journalist blindsided him with his defection, his time in Russia, his renunciation of American citizenship. Oswald's face showed it all. Rage, humiliation. He confronted the reporter afterward, demanding to know the source. He never got an answer. Now the city knew him not just as a Marxist, but as a traitor. At home he was unraveling. Marina was unhappy. An FBI agent sniffing around Marina fed his paranoia. Ferry mocked him, making him more volatile. Oswald's life had no path forward, except the one being drawn for him. By September 1963, he was in Mexico. He went to the Cuban embassy, then the Russian embassy, begging for a visa. He wanted to get to Havana, maybe to reinvent himself. But the Cubans said no. It had to go through Moscow, and that could take months. Moscow turned him away, too. Oswald left with nothing. What he didn't know, he was being watched the whole time. Every move, every embassy visit, every conversation reported straight to James Jesus Angleton at CIA Counterintelligence. A photo was taken of Oswald in Mexico City, but it wasn't even him. The CIA botched it. It didn't matter. There was already enough to build a story. The outline was simple. A US Marine who defected to Russia, married a Russian, came back with a child, handed out pro-Castro leaflets, called himself a Marxist, begged Cuba for a visa. The profile of a traitor. If Kennedy were killed, Oswald was ready-made as the patsy. The cover story was supposed to go like this. Oswald would shoot the president, escape to Mexico, and fly straight to Havana. But Marcello, through Ferry, told him the truth. There'd be no escape. He wasn't flying anywhere. He would die on the spot. Meanwhile, the propaganda was being prepared. Cuban exile leaders like Branguier and John Martino were ready to feed the press the narrative. Oswald, the Castro sympathizer, acting on orders from Havana. Marcello wanted it that way. No Italian names, no mob fingerprints, only compromised CIA and FBI assets, Cuban exiles, and a disgruntled Marine. Dallas would be clean. But above Marcello was something even larger. Titans of industry. The men who had wanted a private agency to protect their global interests long before the CIA was born. They'd pushed men like Tom Dewey and Richard Nixon into politics. They'd backed the creation of a covert bureaucracy that Truman resisted until the Soviets' bomb forced it through. The first CIA coup wasn't over communism. It was over bananas, United Fruit. And United Fruit had been tied to the New Orleans Mafia since the early 1900s. By 1963, the system had matured. Big business, the mob, intelligence, foreign allies, all one machine. And Oswald was caught in its gears. In Dallas, the story would be written in blood. And every road, every connection, every player led back to New Orleans. Kennedy was playing both sides of the table, fighting the system while using it. That's the truth. On April 17th, 1961, the Bay of Pigs exploded into disaster. Kennedy's young presidency was only months old when Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, hit the beaches of Cuba and got slaughtered. It was a humiliation. Kennedy had trusted the experts, and they burned him. Instead of backing off, he doubled down. That summer, the Kennedys, Jack and Bobby, turned to Operation Mongoose, a CIA program designed to take down Fidel Castro by any means possible. Sabotage, psychological warfare, straight-up assassination. The sabotage wasn't small stuff. CIA-backed operatives bombed hospitals, factories, and water plants. The point was simple: make life in Cuba unbearable, starve the people of medicine and water, then let them rise up against Castro. It was the same playbook the US would dust off decades later in Iran and elsewhere. Destabilize first, invade second. But Cuba wasn't the only target. The Kennedys quietly backed plots against leaders across Latin America. The most infamous was Rafael Trujillo, the iron-fisted dictator of the Dominican Republic. Trujillo had been useful. He let CIA-backed fighters train on his soil for another crack at Castro. But he was also brutal, unpredictable, and too close to organized crime. Washington wanted him gone. On May 30th, 1961, Trujillo was ambushed and riddled with bullets. Officially, the US played it cool hands off, nothing to see. But dissidents had already received weapons funneled to them with American approval. The assassination sent shockwaves through organized crime. Trujillo had been a bridge between mobsters, politicians, and spooks. His murder showed that even allies could be taken off the board if they became liabilities. And all this while, Kennedy was standing at the United Nations, telling the world the US would not provoke Castro. Publicly, restraint; privately, green lights. And the newspapers reported it all, sometimes openly. Yet, nobody connected the dots. Then came something darker. In early 1962, the Joint Chiefs of Staff drafted a plan under Operation Mongoose. Its name, Operation Northwoods. It was a blueprint for false flag terror inside the United States. The plan called for hijacking planes, sinking boats of Cuban refugees, bombing American cities, even sabotaging US military bases, and blaming it all on Castro. In March 1962, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara saw the proposal. When it hit Kennedy's desk, he rejected it outright. He was shaken by how extreme it was. It never got approved. But here's the part history books gloss over. Northwoods wasn't just a military fantasy. Cuban exiles and organized crime figures were floating through the plan. For the mob, the shock wasn't that the Pentagon wanted to fake an attack. The shock was realizing how far the CIA was willing to go. If they could justify staging attacks, why not just carry out the real thing? Kill Kennedy, blame it on Castro, and get two birds with one stone, end Kennedy's war on the mob, and clear the way for an invasion of Cuba. That idea, at the time, was unthinkable. But after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Kennedy's tough stance against Castro softened. He started exploring back-channel talks with Havana. To men who had bet everything on crushing Castro, mobsters, exiles, and hardliners in the CIA, this smelled like betrayal. By 1963, people with the means and the motive were capable of putting together something bigger than Northwoods. A real hit. Kennedy out, Johnson in. And with Johnson, a harder line on Cuba. More sabotage, more poisoned wells, more pressure until the island cracked. Years later, when Carlos Marcello, the New Orleans boss with everything to lose, found himself cornered, the story surfaced again. In 1968, as New Orleans DA Jim Garrison launched his JFK investigation, Marcello fed him information. He pointed to Operation Mongoose, the CIA's dirtiest laundry. Garrison ran with it. Why? Timing. By 1968, Robert Kennedy was running for the White House. Highlighting the CIA's reckless plots embarrassed the Kennedys, not Nixon. For Marcello, it was perfect. He had hated the Kennedys for unleashing the Justice Department on him. If Garrison could use the CIA's games to discredit Bobby, it killed two problems at once. And that's how the secret war, Cuba, the mob, the CIA, bled into Dallas, and then into 1968. It wasn't just about Castro. It was about power, survival, and who was willing to cross the line. July 1962. The Atlanta Constitution ran a headline that should have rocked the country. U.S. convict gets life for killing. The convict was Joseph Valachi, a 59-year-old New York mobster already serving time on narcotics charges. He'd beaten a fellow inmate, John Soap, with a pipe in the yard of Atlanta Penitentiary. Soap died from skull fractures 2 days later. Prosecutors said it was cold-blooded murder. Valachi's lawyer said it was survival. Rumors inside the joint branded Valachi a rat, and he thought Soap was spreading them. So, he killed him. The headlines ran once, and then Valachi's name vanished. No follow-ups, no coverage, as if he'd disappeared from the face of the earth. But behind the scenes, Robert Kennedy had him. Valachi started talking, and once he opened his mouth, he never stopped. For Kennedy, it was gold. For organized crime, it was poison. Robert Kennedy knew the danger. He remembered Abe Rayles, the government star witness in Brooklyn who fell out of a hotel window under guard in 1941. He remembered Anthony LaTempa, dead in his cell from poison strong enough to kill 8 horses, right before he was set to testify against Vito Genovese. Valachi could be next, but Kennedy made his choice. He would use him. The mob's reaction was immediate. Vito Genovese, still running things from his prison cell, gave the order. He called Mike Miranda, the respected old-timer, and Miranda relayed the message to Carlo Gambino and the others. Kill Valachi at all costs. But Valachi was already under federal protection, hidden away, and he was giving Robert Kennedy exactly what he needed: names, structures, rituals, the blueprint of a secret society most Americans didn't even believe existed. He called it Cosa Nostra. By the summer of 1963, the Justice Department confirmed it. At the top sat a commission. Each city had a family. They controlled gambling, narcotics, and extortion. They held summits, like the one in Appalachian in 1957. Valachi laid it out: the bosses, the soldiers, the rules. For the first time, the Mafia was real, official, undeniable. In August, Kennedy made it public. Valachi testified before Senator John McClellan's committee. On live television, America heard about initiation ceremonies, oaths of silence, and blood rituals. It was the first time the veil had been ripped off La Cosa Nostra. For the mob, it was checkmate. For the Kennedys, it was a death sentence. Because Valachi hadn't just exposed the Mafia. He'd tied together the threads Robert Kennedy already suspected. Narcotics pipelines, CIA connections, corrupt politicians, businessmen who had propped up the agency since United Fruit. The same system Franklin Roosevelt had once threatened to rein in was now being dragged into the light. At the same time, John Kennedy was breaking the Southern establishment. When Martin Luther King walked into the White House and shook the president's hand, Dixiecrats saw the message. Kennedy was no longer their man. They wanted him gone. Now the Kennedys had 2 sets of enemies, the old Southern elite and the Mafia, and thanks to Valachi, both were exposed. By late '62, Santo Trafficante was already muttering that Kennedy should be hit in Dallas. Carlos Marcello said the same to his circle. John Martino and Cuban exile leaders echoed it. By 63, it wasn't whispering anymore. It was planned. Jacqueline Kennedy knew. After Dallas, when she cradled her husband's body, she screamed, "They killed him. They killed him." She didn't mean Oswald. She meant they, the men Robert had told her about, the men Valachi had described, the men whose empire stretched back to the early 1900s. Robert Kennedy had exposed Cosa Nostra on national television on September 25, 1963. By the 22nd of November 1963, his brother was dead in Dallas. When John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Robert Kennedy was on the phone. Word reached him almost at once. The next day, news reached him an arrest warrant had just gone out for David Ferry, the New Orleans pilot tied to Carlos Marcello, the same man Lee Harvey Oswald had been running with. Robert called Aaron Cohen, the investigator who had hounded Marcello for years. Cohen gave him the news. Just hours before the hit in Dallas, Ferry had been in court with Marcello. Then he vanished. Now, law enforcement was after him. Robert understood. The shooter was from New Orleans, and the man who would soon silence him came from Chicago, Jack Ruby. Ruby wasn't a lone gunman. He was tied into Sam Giancana's outfit, connected to Alan Dorfman, the mob's money man who funneled Teamster pension billions into underworld hands. Even Jimmy Hoffa's son later admitted it. Hoffa had met Ruby multiple times. Ruby wasn't a stranger. He was part of the Chicago fix teams, the men who cleaned up messes. When Ruby shot Oswald, it was over in a flash. The patsy was dead, just like Marcello wanted, just like the CIA needed. The Oswald Castro trail would now be all over the radio and news. Ruby sat with his head in his hands afterward, trying to make sense of it. He had murdered a man in front of Texas Rangers, Dallas police, and the world press. He was no hero. He was a cleanup man, and he knew what happened to cleanup men who talked. If John Kennedy had still been alive, with Robert at his side, someone might have gotten Ruby to crack. Someone might have pressed him on the calls he made to Bobby Baker in the weeks before the assassination. On whom he spoke to in the days before he pulled the trigger. On why he had silenced Oswald. But John was dead. Lyndon Johnson was president now. Johnson, the man tied into Texas oil money, tied into Bobby Baker, tied into New Orleans mobsters. With Johnson, the mob and their allies in Washington were back in charge. Robert Kennedy was broken and alone. Ruby tried, half-heartedly. When the Warren Commission came to see him, he begged them to take him to Washington. He said he'd talk there, not in Dallas. They refused. He stayed locked in. The most astonishing detail came in those first hours after the shooting. Ruby should have been under maximum guard, surrounded by Secret Service, Rangers, Dallas police. Instead, one man, the mob boss of Dallas, was allowed to walk straight past the phalanx with his wife and sit with Ruby alone. No questions, no interruptions. The message was clear. Ruby understood. He could be another Abe Relis who fell out a window under guard. Another LaTempa poisoned in his cell before he could testify. Ruby kept quiet. He never spoke about what happened. He died of cancer before his appeal. His brother walked into one of Marcello's casinos, placed a single bet, and walked out rich. That was the payoff. The final reminder to keep quiet. Robert Kennedy knew. He knew his war on organized crime had caught up with him. Hoover had warned him to slow down, to handle it quietly. Robert had refused. He had smashed into the system head-on, dragging the Mafia into the light on national television. He had uncovered not just crime families, but a shadow government, mob bosses, CIA men, business titans, and political elites. They controlled Hollywood, the press, and the story of America itself. Robert refused to play along, and for that, he paid with his life in 1968. No man after him ever tried again. The machine survived. It grew stronger. Decades later, Jeffrey Epstein would prove the point. He was given a sweetheart deal so soft it stunned even prosecutors. Negotiated from Israel, he came and went from jail as he pleased. The man who signed that deal wound up in the Trump administration. Others who protected Epstein were promoted, not punished. When Epstein finally died, the investigation died with him. No one else faced justice. That was the kind of case Robert Kennedy would have blown wide open. He would have dragged every name into the light, forced testimony on live television, exposed America for what it really was. But he never got the chance. He didn't even survive 1968. By 1975, the facade was cracking. The silence that had shielded Carlos Marcello for more than a decade was wearing thin. Watergate had changed the country, and the Senate was prying open doors long thought sealed. The Church Committee was hauling the CIA into the light for its overseas assassination plots. Reporters were openly asking whether the same hands had reached Dallas. For Marcello, it was a dangerous shift. For years he had lived in the shadows of rumor. David Ferry's name tied to his own. Whispers of Jack Ruby's phone calls. Testimony from men like Hoffa's son who admitted Hoffa and Ruby had met. These were fragments, but in the post-Watergate atmosphere, fragments were enough to pull him into the line of fire. On January 7, 1975, Marcello walked into a federal courtroom in New Orleans. The indictment was about a suburban nightclub, the Crash Landing, a muscle job, extortion, and a 51% interest taken by force. Hobbs Act violations, RICO counts. On paper, it was about a nightclub. In reality, everyone in the room knew it was about something larger. Marcello's role as the Mafia's southern chieftain, the man RFK had once sworn to bring down, and the man many believed had ordered the hit that silenced RFK's brother in Dallas. The Kefauver Committee had already branded Marcello the most powerful Mafia boss in Louisiana back in the 1950s. The Valachi hearings in the 60s had only hardened that view. And now, nearly 20 years after Robert Kennedy had tried to deport him to Guatemala with nothing but a one-way ticket, Marcello was back under oath, older but still untouchable. But this time, the questions cut closer. Robert Blakey, chief counsel to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, pressed Marcello on his associations with Ferry, with Ruby, with men tied directly to the events of November 22, 1963. Marcello dodged, invoked the Fifth, smirked. Yet for the first time, the architecture of suspicion was no longer just whispered in FBI back rooms. It was on the record, in public hearings. The danger was real. That same year, John Martino, a Cuban exile with ties to Santo Traficante, turned up dead. Martino had hinted too much about what he knew. About Cuba, about the Kennedys, about Dallas. His murder was a reminder to Marcello of what happened when loose ends dangled too far. Meanwhile, Senator Frank Church announced that his committee would investigate CIA involvement in foreign assassinations. The names Castro and Lumumba were mentioned, but behind closed doors, governors and senators whispered about the Kennedys and Martin Luther King. In the poisoned atmosphere of 1975, nothing seemed beyond possibility. Marcello could feel it tightening. The tomatoes and strawberries his Pelican Tomato Company sold to the Defense Department, over $1 million worth, suddenly made headlines. What had once been shrugged off as business as usual was now portrayed as proof that the Mafia's tentacles reached even into Pentagon cafeterias. His brother, Joe Marcello Jr., couldn't even secure a liquor license without the family name dragging him down in print. The old protections were gone. America no longer trusted the government's word. Not after Watergate. Not after Hoover's death. Not after the CIA's lies unraveled in the press. And in that climate, the Kennedy assassination was no longer a closed case. It was the open wound of American politics, and Carlos Marcello was sitting on the witness stand while the nation's most powerful committees circled closer than ever before. For Marcello, 1975 was not just another trial. It was the moment Dallas, Ferry, Ruby, and the Kennedys came roaring back, threatening to undo the carefully constructed silence that had kept him alive since November 1963.
Right as it stands right now, there's only two of us left alive. That's me and Sano Traficani. And as far as I'm concerned, we're both going to stay alive because I ain't going to say shit. The only thing I'm saying is any of you assholes come near me, you better have a fucking army with you, baby, because I've got my shit together, and I'll blow the first one of you motherfuckers away that even comes near me. And that you can put in print.
By the mid-70s, the story of Dallas wouldn't stay buried. Loran Hall, a self-styled adventurer who once ran guns to Cuba, was suing the National Tatler for $100 million. The tabloid had splashed his face across a July 1975 issue under the headline, "These Men Murdered President John Kennedy." They called him part of a sniper team with Eladio del Valle, a Cuban politician later found shot and beaten to death in Miami. Hall swore he'd been in California, not on the grassy knoll, when Kennedy was cut down. The articles cost him jobs, marriages, even his place in church. Hall was used to being around shadows. He'd fought alongside Castro, then against him, and landed in Jim Garrison's crosshairs in New Orleans. But being branded the trigger man in Dealey Plaza was a stain he couldn't wash off. The conspiracy press was back in full swing. Letters poured into editors. Citizens wrote that it wasn't just Oswald, that CIA breakaways, FBI splinters, or both had pulled the strings. Names kept surfacing. Ferry, Shaw, Ruby, Brading, Roselli, Giancana. Witnesses died quick and messy. Skeptics pointed out the pattern. Ferry dead before Garrison could arrest him, Shaw dead in 74, Roselli dumped in an oil drum in Miami after talking to the Senate. While the old witnesses fell silent, the mob world itself was shifting. Carlo Gambino died in 76, and the fight to be capo di tutti capi was on. Carmine Galante, fresh out of prison, moved fast to combine power, with international heroin connections and open lines to Marcello in New Orleans and Trafficante in Florida. Agnello della Croce, Gambino's underboss, was too sick to stop him. Law enforcement warned that Galante was as ruthless as they came, and now positioned to weld together New York, Florida, and Louisiana, the same triangle suspected of having a hand in Dallas. At the same time, Congress reopened the past. The House Assassinations Committee planted an office in New Orleans and began rerunning Garrison's old playbook, hauling in Marcello, asking about Ferry, asking about Oswald. Marcello admitted paying Ferry, but only to snoop on a government witness in one of his deportation fights. He insisted he'd been in federal court the day Kennedy died. He was calm, measured, every answer stripped down. But everyone in the room knew what wasn't being said. Ferry was dead. Ruby was dead. Hoffa was gone. Giancana gone. Roselli gone. Marcello was the last one left breathing. The leaks never stopped. In March 1977, a former stripper told investigators that Ruby had introduced her to Oswald 2 weeks before the assassination. She said Ruby called him Lee Harvey Oswald of the CIA. 2 days after Dallas, she claimed, agents came to her apartment and took the film she'd shot of the motorcade. Gone, just like that. That same spring, George de Mohrenschildt, the Russian émigré who had shepherded Oswald around Dallas, blew his brains out with a shotgun in Florida just hours after investigators tried to track him down. The tape recorder in the next room captured his footsteps, the pause, the blast. On his desk were papers mentioning Oswald. The hits kept coming. Marita Lorenz, Castro's old lover and sometime CIA asset, claimed she rode into Dallas with Oswald and Frank Sturgis, the Watergate burglar. She said Sturgis fired from the knoll. Sturgis denied it, claimed he had papers tying Castro to Ruby instead. Either way, the names wouldn't go away. Oswald, Ruby, Marcello, Giancana, trafficante. And now the committees had nurses and doctors from Parkland Hospital saying bullet fragments were pulled from Governor Connolly that didn't match the magic bullet. Even Connolly's wounds, they whispered, didn't square with the Warren report. By 77, the public no longer believed in lone gunmen. A European documentary, flat out, said what many Americans now suspected, that Dallas wasn't coincidence, it was conspiracy. In Italy, they called it obvious. In America, it was finally becoming thinkable. Through it all, Carlos Marcello kept his head down in Metairie, still running tomatoes and casinos, still fighting off indictments. But every time his name surfaced, in Garrison's files, in Valachi's notes, in Ruby's orbit, the walls closed a little tighter. Dallas was 14 years gone, but the ghosts weren't.